Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Tertulia. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Matthew Hayes. I'm a sociology professor at St. Thomas University and Canada Research Chair in Global and International Studies. Tonight's Tertulia is organized by a group of people at UNB and St. Thomas, including Tracy Glynn, Christy Lane, and Daniel Tubb. Tonight, Adi Rao is also hosting tonight, and of course Megan Hill, who's also helping to organize tonight's event. Tonight's Tertulia organizers are on unceded Wolastoqey territory, and we'd invite you to consider how the occupation of this territory over the last 250 years has helped shape unequal access to resources and space. Tonight's event is sponsored by the NB Media Co-op, the Raven Rural Action and Voices for the Environment, the Atlantic Regional Solidarity Network, and book publishers Fernwood, Between the Lines, Verso, and the Canadian Scholars Women's Press. Without further ado, tonight's Tertulia is being hosted by Adi Rao, who will introduce the speakers, and I will turn it over to him.
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be asked to introduce our speakers and moderate this conversation tonight. My name is Aditya Rao. I'm a human rights lawyer and work in the labor movement here in New Brunswick. I'm especially excited about the topic tonight because social justice in our cities has been top of mind for many of us lately. I am, along with Tracy, Christy, Matthew, Tobin, and others on and off this call, a member of the New Brunswick Coalition for Tenants' Rights. We just released a municipal platform for what cities can do to protect tenants and further the right to adequate housing. We did this because cities in New Brunswick claim they can't do anything about housing. In fact, here in Fredericton alone, our mayor has said that homelessness is not a municipal issue. Our city council hemmed and hawed before granting, under many conditions, $900,000 to an affordable housing project. And just days later, they voted to deny a simple zoning amendment for an expansion of a drop-in center that would have provided supportive housing to homeless members of our community. Well, we think they're wrong, and so do about a couple dozen other cities in the country mentioned in our municipal platform. So it's actually especially great to see so many city council candidates who are on the call right now with us. We're also part of a local activist network called Solidarity Fredericton, which has been looking at police spending in cities. In Fredericton, the city spends over a fifth of its budget on policing alone and almost no money until recently on housing. Our municipal police forces routinely stop and ask people for identification for no reason. And it'll come as no surprise to you that this practice, known as carding, has been shown to disproportionately target Indigenous and Black people in New Brunswick and across the country. Our municipal services also not infrequently share personal information with law enforcement. Sometimes this means sharing information about someone's immigration status when they're interacting with municipal police forces, or even when they're just trying to access emergency shelter or food banks. We know that this has resulted in the deportation and forced separation of families across this country. We're also just days away from a municipal election taking place across the province, or at least in most of the province. Some of our friends in some other parts of the province are of course not voting till May 25th. But this month, we will be electing municipal leaders who will determine whether and to what extent social justice will be a priority in their cities and municipalities. We're also on the cusp of a major municipal reform in New Brunswick, the Local Governance Reform Project. It points out that in New Brunswick, there are 104 local governments, 8 cities, 26 towns, 61 villages, 1 regional municipality, 8 rural communities, and 236 local service districts. The government wants to radically restructure and reform what municipalities look like in our province, and just today they announced public consultations on the subject. So tonight's conversation is incredibly timely and could not be more relevant to our current context. I'll introduce our speakers one at a time before I invite them each to give their presentation. We're gonna move to Professor Julia Woodhall-Melnik, who is going to be speaking about the Unprotected and Ignored Renter, movement toward rental policy reform, poverty reduction, and vibrant communities in Saint John. Julia Woodhall-Melnik is an assistant professor at UNB Saint John, the lead investigator on a 5-year Institutes of Health Research project grant that explores affordable housing and mental health, and the research director of the Housing, Mobilization, Engagement, and Resilience Lab. She'll speak about the gentrification of the Central Peninsula in Saint John and the effect of the city's overheating housing market on lower income residents. the question, who is included and who is excluded in the future of St. John? Julia, it's all yours.
Okay, so thank you all for having me today, for Matthew for inviting me, Addie for facilitating, and Tracy for planning. I very much appreciate it, and to my fellow panelists for joining tonight. So I'm a little bit rusty. I'm on maternity leave. I've actually been on maternity leave for almost a complete year now. So please bear with me as I regain my academic bearings a little bit here under sleep deprivation. So I had an experience last week actually that's made me change my approach to this presentation a little bit. So I'll get there at the end of my talk, and I ask that you bear with me as I plug through things. So I'd like to start by asking you all to think back to the beginning of the pandemic, with the first cases of COVID-19 arriving in New Brunswick in March 2020. We all quickly adapted to a rapidly changing world. Schools and childcare were closed, people worked from home, and our essential workers, many of them unpaid, young, and women, went out to work in a very uncertain landscape. Everything shut down. People lost work, and the government, a conservative minority at the time, stepped in with offers of protection. One of those was a moratorium on residential evictions that extended only to May 31st, 2020. We all know that despite deaths, New Brunswick's COVID story has played out better than most. There was a surge of new middle-class remote workers across Canada who started to look at New Brunswick and the opportunities it offered for cheap housing and relative freedom from COVID and the daunting restrictions that accompanied a high prevalence of disease. However, in 2020, our interprovincial net migration rate was -37, and our increase, or sorry, I should say this in Saint John, and our increase of approximately 1,000 residents to Saint John actually came from international migration. It turns out the mass migration from Western Canada to Saint John is a nice story, but it doesn't play out in the data, and it doesn't explain the housing market growth in 2020. However, during 2020, investors took notice of the cheap and historically sluggish housing market in the Central Peninsula. According to the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation's 2020 rental market analysis, the vacancy rate in the census metropolitan area of Saint John dropped from a categorized 3.3, which was categorized a letter grade of B in 2019, to a 3.1% vacancy rate. So we're now sitting at a C level in the grade scheme in 2020. So despite this dropping vacancy rate, we see an addition of 519 rental units in 2020. This tells me that investors have found us here in Saint John, and developers have found us as well. A low vacancy rate coupled with some of the most deplorable tenants' rights in Canada makes New Brunswick an attractive place to set up shop. So let's look at how this impacts Saint Johners. Renters in Saint John make up only 19% of households, whereas 81% of households are homeowners. According to CMHC, there are no households living in cooperative housing in Saint John. This is disheartening in and of itself. The diversity in affordable housing supply and options within the city is sorely lacking in this region. I won't harp on this for too long, however, as I know it's a topic in and of itself. So one may theorize that Saint John has offered the working class an opportunity to participate as owners in a relatively affordable housing market in the past. I'm convinced that this is not the case any longer, and it will continue to get worse. According to the New Brunswick Realtors Association, home sales increased by 12.3% in 2020. At the same time, rents increased from an average of $764 to $788 from 2019 to 2020. This doesn't seem overly shocking, but it represents an average increase of 3.6%, which is higher than what's allowed by many of our neighboring provinces with rent control policies. Anecdotally, we've heard stories of mass rent increases, with landlords raising rents by hundreds of dollars in a constrained rental market where workers experienced layoffs in light of a pandemic and a non-existent cruise ship season. Further, the New Brunswick government, now a conservative majority, has done nothing to protect renters from the ongoing impacts of the pandemic following May 31st, 2020. Rather, a 90-day rental review where tenants, alongside more privileged homeowners, landlords, and developers were invited to share their experiences. So what are we hearing so far in 2021? Well, the story isn't well documented in our data yet. What we do know is that home sales have sped up even more than they did last year in Saint John. Anecdotal evidence of Western Canadian interprovincial migration is still being discussed broadly, and we are still left with very few rights for tenants. As the housing market speeds up and the vacancy rate remains low, renters are further priced out of home ownership and are forced to rent in a market where their landlords can annually increase rents or terminate tenancies without justification. The reason why I've brought up the pandemic so much here is because it offered us an opportunity. It gave us an opportunity to build a more equitable society. COVID made the gaps in our systems too powerful to remain unseen. However, despite promises of a feminist recovery, investments in housing, and discussions of a universal basic income, the determination of individuals who wish to maintain the status quo and tout growth, attracting developers, and they're saying this is Saint John's great savior. So I want to leave you with the story. Again, it's short. I'm on mat leave, so I didn't have too much prep time, but I want to leave you with a story today. Although I'm partial to looking at numbers, I had a meaningful experience that I mentioned to you at the beginning of this talk that was meaningful to say the least. Last week, my doctoral student, Courtney Perk, alongside Dr. J.P. Lewis, ran a series of forums for Saint John's municipal candidates. I agreed to moderate the forum for my ward, Ward 2. Two young men stood out to me, both UNB Saint John grads, both at the school that I teach at, both hyper-conservative, and both bashing rent control and praising development and growth with no constraints. Other candidates piled in agreement with this anti-tenant rhetoric, which illustrates to us how opinions in the municipality can change what actually happens on the ground. So I read my kids this storybook called Be a Purple Person. And in it, it says that purple people ask important questions. So I'd like to ask some questions here. I ask, if cheap developments and a lack of tenants' rights has not, and I quote, fixed Saint John yet, why are we still trying it? My definition of fixed means that everyone has what they need to live a healthy and meaningful life. I want to live in a world where we all have our basic human right to housing acknowledged and available. If it's just about economic growth, I ask, what's the point of it all? Do we want to live in a world where the point of our entire lives is to grow an economy? So why not build better? Why not build something else as we build back from this pandemic? So to those who continue to tout the status quo over the actual lives of low-income people who are priced out of home ownership in Saint John and forced to participate in a market with no tenant rights, and I say this as somebody who lived in Ontario who thought tenants' rights were bad there. Moving out here 3 years ago, I rent the bottom half of our house out. And looking into the requirements for me being a landlord, it was shocking. It was that I had 2 entrances to their unit. And that if they gave me a deposit, I registered it with the rentalsman. And to me, that was absolutely deplorable and shocking. And I've hopefully held myself to a higher standard than that. So for those who do continue to look for growth and view the economy as something that's more important and more powerful than people's lives, I'd like to leave you with a screenshot of my face that my doctoral student captured while one of the 2 conservative young men spoke during the talk the other day. So I'm going to pull this up for you. I'm hoping it becomes a meme at some point, but we'll see. There we go. So although I was moderating, I could not do anything really to stop that look from popping across my face as I heard rent control bashing go on. So thank you so much. Again, I apologize it's a little bit short, but I appreciate the opportunity to share this point of view.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Julia. And what a great anecdote and an excellent photograph that I hope does become a meme for time to come. This is obviously something that some of us have been working together with you on and are really have been really following closely. And you mentioned something in your presentation, Julia, about the Premier's action or lack of action. And when he announced the 90-day review back in February, after we had put out an open letter signed by over 30 community organizations calling for rent control, calling for immediate action on tenants' rights in the province, the day after that, when he announced the 90-day review, of course, our response was, well, we were happy to see this, but it was also just kicking the can down the road. Well, 90 days have more or less elapsed, and we just got word today that the report from the review is coming down at the end of this week, a full 3 days ahead of schedule. So that's very exciting, and we're looking forward to seeing what is in that report, and we can't wait to report back to all of you and to the rest of the community what we think about that. So thank you so much, Julia, for that engaging presentation.
Thank you, Addie. And maybe for when that report comes across, I can lend you the picture of my face.
That sounds great. That sounds excellent.
This panel, Social Justice and the City in New Brunswick, held on May 5th, 2021, was organized by Tertulias Fredericton as part of the city's edition and was supported by the Canada Research Chair in Global and International Studies and the MB Media Co-op.